Right, so I would like to welcome everyone to today's event, Noni Jabavu's Words and Worlds. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Black British South African literary pioneer. The team at the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities are delighted to be hosting this panel discussion today. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Janet Remmington chairing this discussion for us. Janet is an associate of the Humanities Research Centre at the University of York and the African Literature Department of the University of Witwatersrand. I'll now pass over to Janet, who will introduce our panel and our talk for the day. Janet.
Well, thank you very much, Joe.
Sorry, Janet, could you speak a little louder? We still can't hear you currently.
Right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? Okay, there we go. As you can see, we are meeting in person as far as some of the panel is concerned. So we're trying to do a hybrid event, which is very exciting after so long being in lockdown. So I'm very pleased to be chairing this session, and we'll be honouring and exploring the life and work of Noni Jabavu. And so I'll go on shortly to introduce our panel. But just before, a couple of words of thanks. Firstly to WRoCAH for arranging this very exciting opportunity to talk more about Jabavu, and for Black History Month in the UK, and also to the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, which is hosting us locally in South Africa. So I'm here with Athambile, Masola, and Makhosazana, Xaba. And I will go on to just give a bit more detail about the structure of our event today and also a bit about our speakers. So we'll start off by hearing from writer and scholar Makhosazana Xaba. And she has just recently been appointed Associate Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, he is the doyen of Noni Jabavu studies and also her biographer. And she will give us an overview of Noni Jabavu's richly textured life on the move. We'll then move on to hear from Dr. Charles Fonge, who is University Archivist at the Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York. And he will open up some archival detail, both about Noni Jabavu's years as a schoolgirl in the 1930s in York, and then also concerning some materials and papers that Jabavu herself deposited in the archive at York in the 1970s. And then our final speaker and discussant will be Dr. Athambile Masola of the Historical Studies Department at the University of Cape Town. She does leading work on the intellectual histories of Black women. And she will reflect on a few key themes coming out of our discussion today. And then after we've heard from our three speakers, we will give the audience an opportunity to ask questions and to comment. And we'd very much like this to be interactive. So thank you all very much. And I'll hand over now to Kosi Xaba.
Greetings, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting us to do this. It's always very exciting for me to be talking about Noni because whatever event it is, I often learn something new. And yeah, so my role today is to just share very briefly the scope of her biography and in particular her contributions to culture and literature, because that was what really attracted me to her. So thanks, Charles. Could I have the next screen, the next slide? So, isn't the first slide the biography? Could I have the, yeah, thank you. So I thought I'd just map out the timeline of what I call the peripatetic print of Noni Jabavu's life. And I got those words from one of the editions that she edited when she was working at the New Strand magazine in the 60s. And she talks about herself as having the peripatetic print of her feet, which is a very interesting thing, because as I go through the timeline, you will notice just how much movement was part of who she was, and she saw herself as that kind of person. And I don't even think I have enough of the countries that she moved through, because these are the ones that I found out from where she wrote about herself. So born in 1919 in Alice, where her parents were, I remember thinking, wow, she was born in 1919. This was when the Spanish influenza was busy happening. Was her mother lucky or what not to have been affected? And she was born in August of 1919. But then what happens later in the same year, her elder sister, who had been born before her, died. And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, I wonder what the circumstances were. And now that we're in the time of the pandemic, we can think about that and make connections. But I remember being very struck, because I had, even before I started working on Noni, I had read about the numbers and how the pandemic had affected South Africa at that time. So she grows up in 1919, and it's important to notice that it's 3 years after the first South African university, which is now known as Forte. And both her parents are on campus. So right on, she is a child in a family where the world is her life. And she writes about this and how it was interesting for her that everybody had who was coming and visiting from anywhere ended up in her home, because her father, DDT Jabavu, was teaching at the college. And the first two lecturers were DDT Jabavu and Alexandra Kerr. So when she turns 13 in 1933, her parents decide to send her to the UK. And she's under the care of Margaret, I'm trying to remember the surname, Margaret Clark, who happened to be great friends with Jan Smuts, who was also great friends with DDT Jabavu. And I mention that because it's very interesting when we look back to those times and see what kinds of relationships and connections people had in their private lives that are not written about when the big stories of the political lives are being told. So Margaret Clark and the partner, Gillett, they become her foster parents, and they lived in Oxford. But she goes to school in York in the north, where the school had been established for girls. And that's where she does her high school education and completes her matric there. I don't know if it was called matric then. But then I just mapped out here the fact that there was a time when she was at the Birmingham University, she was at the Buckingham Palace when she was finally settling into her own life, and then in London. She may have lived in many other areas, as I was saying earlier, but these are the ones I can confirm and have references for. So in South Africa, she was in Alice, where she was born, and then her parents bought a place and built a home in Middledrift. And then when she visited in 1977, she spent some time at Rhodes University and in Cape Town, and of course, Johannesburg, where she had a lot of relatives. In the continent of Africa, she went to live in Uganda in 1955. Now, what's important about that is 1955 is the year when her brother, who was at the University of Witwatersrand, studying medicine, had died. And so she comes home for the funeral, but also takes the time to visit family. So there was family in the Eastern Cape, family in the then Transvaal, and her sister, Alexandra, had married a Ugandan, so she wanted to go visit her sister. So she goes there, and in the many conversations that happen, she decides to go and live there with her partner at the time. So she spent some time in Uganda, and that was when she started writing what later became her first memoir, Drawn in Color. Because Drawn in Color is a memoir of her visit to South Africa at that time. So she writes it while she's living in Uganda. And in 1959, because her daughter Temi was now old enough to go to high school, they decide with a partner to come back to the UK. And come 1960, the book is published. But later in the mid-70s, she moved to Kenya. And in the early 80s, she moved to Zimbabwe. And when she came back to South Africa, she had been living in Zimbabwe. And then in the Caribbean, she went straight to Jamaica in the early 60s, 1962, with her partner at the time. And I read somewhere that she also spent some time in Trinidad. I'm not quite sure where exactly. And then she writes about having been to France, to Switzerland, to Italy, where she was either researching for some of the journals, some of the newspapers she was writing for. But Italy is important because that was where a publisher ended up having her first book translated, and it was published in Italy. Latin America, she's been to Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico. In one of the letters, for instance, I found out that she was in Mexico when she was writing the sequel to Drawn in Color, which she called the Auca People. So in that particular letter, she describes what it's like around her, and she was just very happy to have been able to write from Mexico. But she was writing from Mexico, but she was living in Kingston, Jamaica. So she had taken a writer's retreat, clearly. And then she writes about North America, being in the US, Canada, and her other travels. She died in South Africa. She was living in a frail care center called Lynette Elliott in East London. So to talk about her contributions to culture and literature. Charles, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the things I was saying earlier that I came across her book, Drawn in Color, and that was my initial attraction to her, because as a reader, I was quite surprised that I hadn't heard of her. The book was in a secondhand bookstore, and I read it so quickly with such excitement because I thought, wow, another Black woman writing. As I've done research on her life, it was interesting for me to then find out that she started working at the BBC in 1942. She never was a full-time staff member. She was coming in and out for very specific programs. So the time span is those 11 years. The records that I got for when she was there spent from 1942 to 1963. And she did a range of interesting programs. One of the ones that interested me a lot, actually, was the one that she called These Women Make Music, because she was interested in talking about and interviewing women who were musicians, and most of them were jazz musicians. Now, she writes a lot about how in her family, music was like the pulsation. That's how they live their lives, with music all around. And she also did study some music, though she never finished. So when I read about her doing this program in the BBC, I thought, of course, this is what you'd be interested in. So that's a very interesting long span, and studying the transcripts of what she did there makes me just see just how much of a contribution she made. Okay, we've talked about Drawn in Color, which comes out in 1960, published by John Murray in London. And then between her first and her second book, she gets to be the editor of the new Strand magazine. This was the time when it was resuscitated, because apparently it had closed down in the 50s, I think. I don't remember the exact year now. And then people who were behind the idea of resuscitating it said, well, we need to appoint this woman who Now the book had come out, but I remember reading about one of the funders of the new Strand who said she couldn't be conventional even if she tried, which I thought was a very interesting thing. So she becomes the editor and she writes all the editorials. And then the last editorial is in 1963, because at that time she and the partner then moved to Jamaica. 62, Drawn in Color is published in Italian. And then in 63, The Orca People comes out, also from John Murray. Now, both books, Drawn in Color and The Orca People, were initially published in London by John Murray, and then they were taken over by a New York-based publisher called St. Martin's Press. They have subsequently closed, and I can't get to their archives. And then, as I said earlier, she then came to live in Kenya. So while she was in Kenya, she takes some time, starting in 76, to come and do some research because she wanted to write her father's biography. So in 1977, she's invited by the editor of the Daily Dispatch newspaper to write a weekly column that they ended up calling Noni on Wednesdays. So she's in South Africa, she's doing research, she's traveling, she's reconnecting with family while she's collecting information on her father. But every week, people get to connect with this South African who'd been abroad for so long. And that's why those columns are very interesting to me, because part of what she was doing was to share her life and her travels and what it meant for her to be back in South Africa after so many years to live. Because remember, she had been back as a child when she was in high school, and she had been back after her brother died. But this was the extended period where she was in South Africa, moving between the various Bantustans, and she talks about the difficulties and the challenges of how she couldn't be in any one Bantustan for longer than 3 months, which is a very interesting bit of her life because it speaks to a journey that South Africans took through the legalized apartheid system, and how the Bantustans actually operated and what it meant to be a South African who's visiting and having to navigate your life through the Bantustans. Remember, Bantustans were meant to confine people within what was seen as their tribal histories where they belonged. That was what apartheid wanted to do, divide people up along tribal lines. And for her, it was like, oh, is this what South Africa has become? Okay, I went a bit off tangent there. 1982, The Orca People comes out, and then 1980 to 1987, she's now in Zimbabwe, based in Harare, and she writes for, I have now found 3, I think, newspapers, an opinion piece there, and another one there. And so, yeah, that is what I have evidence of right now. Some of her writings that were in other newspapers, for instance, when she was in Uganda, I still haven't been able to lay my hands on. But what's very clear to me is that all through her life, she had that role of a public, I think today people would call it a public intellectual. She was writing and sharing her opinions on things and being accepted as a journalist by the various newspapers wherever she was. Thank you. I think I'll end there.
Khosi. I think we'll move straight over now to Charles.
Good afternoon. It's fantastic to be able to join everyone and such a distinguished panel for this event and to share some items from the archives here in York. Excitingly, Noni Jabavu intersects with the archives at the Borthwick Institute at different stages of her life and in different capacities. While most of the Borthwick's archives are UK related with strong Yorkshire connections, we also hold collections relating to Southern Africa, and these were accumulated largely through the research activity of the university's former Centre for Southern African Studies. Noni's first archival traces in our holdings can be found in the records of the Mount School, and this was the fee-paying Quaker girls' school that was established in York in the 18th century. The Mounts provided its students with a broad education and encouraged creative and sporting interests, promoted values including equality and social justice, and helped its privileged students to develop a wider worldview. Noni, as Cozy said, came to Britain in 1933 when she was only 13 and was first placed briefly at another Quaker school in Oxfordshire before coming to the Mount in September 1934. Her guardians in the UK were Arthur and Mary Gillett. Arthur Gillett was a prominent Quaker who was on the board of Barclays Bank, the nephew of Joseph Rowntree, and a trustee of the Rowntree Charitable Trust in York. His wife, Mary Clark, was a social reformer and member of the Quaker Clark family of shoe shop fame. She had advocated for the women retained in the British concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War and later helped found what was to become Oxfam. It was Arthur Gillett who secured the bursaries to cover Noni's tuition fees and support her studies at the Mount, where their daughter was also a pupil. Noni was at the school from 34 to 36, and the school's archive tracks her time there, sheds lights on her parents' ambitions for Noni to become a doctor, and provides early evidence of her literary talents. It also holds possibly her earliest published works. Noni attended the Quaker school in a period when the progressive education movement was at its height. This placed an emphasis on learning through direct experiences, integrated different subject areas, emphasized the arts and education for democracy, and used the local community as a laboratory of learning. And at the Mount, this was reflected in a civics week and visits to local businesses and council meetings. Notable in terms of Noni's later writing, advocacy and travel are the speakers who came to the school during her time there and helped inform and stimulate that transnational outlook that she had. Journalist Vernon Bartlett spoke to the students on politics and his interviews with Hitler and Mussolini. There were also talks from the German Jewish pacifist Martha Steinitz and on events and politics in India and the position of the Jews in the modern world. In this photograph, we see a 16-year-old Noni and her year group in 1936, just before they matriculated. She studied maths, English and English literature, history, biology, French and music. Noni was a gifted musician and learned both the violin and piano. She excelled in music academically and later went on to study at London's Royal Academy of Music. She also showed a strong aptitude, of course, for English language and literature. Noni became actively involved in the school's literary society. She contributed 3 pieces to their published magazine, The White Cow. Noni's first 2 submissions were short pieces of creative writing, including an imaginary additional chapter to Goldsmith's 18th century novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. It's her 3rd contribution, however, that's the most interesting and personal. It also most closely resonates with her later work and literary style. Titled The Return, it was submitted in 1937, nearly a year after Noni had left the Mount School. In it, Noni describes her return to South Africa after 3 years away at school in England, the joy of seeing her family again, the shock of losing some understanding of her home language, isiXhosa. And she also deals with feelings of foreignness in her own land, an adjustment, and her consciousness of the colour bar that then prevailed in the country, and ends with this affectionate reflection on identity and being back home. The Return intriguingly anticipates the opening of her first memoir, Drawn in Colour, that was published by John Murray in 1960, in which she narrates her journey back from London to South Africa as an adult to attend her brother's funeral. He had been shot by gangsters in Johannesburg in 1955, shortly before completing his medical degree. Noni is not just the subject of the Mount School archive, but as a teenage author is an active participant in its creation. She then reappears in the Borthwick's collections 40 years later, this time as a donor and creator. In 1974, the University's Centre for Southern African Studies began a project to preserve publications and personal archives relating to Southern Africa. The initiative had been the idea of another transnational creative, the African poet and anti-apartheid campaigner, Dennis Brutus. Following a visit from the Centre's director, In 1975, Noni offered copies to the university of some of her family's early photographs and the text of her 1953 testimony to the UN Commission on the Racial Situation in South Africa. Among the photographs Noni donated was this one of her parents' wedding in 1916. Here we see her father, DDT Jabavu, who was the first Black professor at Fort Hare University College and who'd himself studied in the UK at Birmingham. His bride, Florence Tandiswa, had taught at Lovedale, the South African missionary school, where Noni had undertaken her primary education before coming to England. Noni's paternal grandfather, John Tengo Jabavu, stands behind the groom. He was the first Black South African to own and edit a newspaper. Her maternal grandfather, the Reverend Elijah Makhosazana, stands next to him, and he was a minister and journalist and the first Xhosa to qualify in theology. And from 1876, he edited the Lovedale Mission newspaper and was to found the Cape Native Teachers Association. In this later photograph, taken while Noni was away at school in England, we see her immediate family, including little brother Tengo Max, pictured aged sort of 6 or 7, standing with their sister, his parents, and a cousin at their house on the Fort Hare campus. With the donated photographs are also copies of Noni's accompanying descriptions. Her notes go beyond listing names and dates by adding recollections, noting omissions and family legend. Like her published works, they help contribute to a collective or social memory that also continues to reflect and shape her identity. Here, Noni records in the notes memories of her family and the jacaranda trees and the imported grass by their house. In this way, she enshrines certain events and experiences to embody aspects and values that, through the act of archiving, become part of a wider shared cultural history. She constructs an archival memory while continually revisiting her own recollections. She also donated this wonderful image of the Makhosazana family on her mother's side. Seated in the centre are her great-grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Lajabe Makhosazana, who had become part of the Wesleyan Methodist Society in later life. Behind them, third in on the back row, we see an earlier image of her grandfather, the Reverend Elijah Makhosazana, the minister and journalist, who was also a strong proponent of women's education. The annotation that accompanies the image intertwines the provenance of the photograph and details of lineage with recollections linked with her second book, The Ochre People. She includes her uncle's memories as well as snippets of family lore. She provides and proliferates these touchstones that help her connect different spaces, the familial and the academic, oral testimony with the documented record, a personal and private archive with her published works, the researcher and her readers. Even in the simple inscription that we saw penned on her UN statement, Noni extends the discourse to include an isiXhosa saying, and does not dilute or hide aspects of her identity, language, or culture. The South African archivist, Vern Harris, who looks after Nelson Mandela's archive, reflecting on the nature of archives, elegantly contends that, quote, far from being a simple reflection of reality, archives are constructed windows into personal and collective processes. They at once express and are instruments of prevailing relations of power, end quote. Historians often deposit the archive in a language of colonialism as undiscovered territory or untamed country, its unyielding truths awaiting discovery, conquest, and capture. But archives are not neutral or immutable or even static. They're political and involved in processes over time. They, their creators, custodians, and interlocutors can reinforce inequalities and elisions and can create narratives that silence voices. But archives can also be liberatory and reactionary. The processes they're involved in can be personal as well as collective or administrative. Archives donors and archivists are active agents who equally can act to help protect and project those voices of those who are silenced or ghosted by prevailing structures of power and privilege. I believe in part Noni was such an agent. We see her agency in her authorship, in her selection of material, in her deposit of archives, recording of memories, the referencing of her books, and documenting terms in isiXhosa. She provides more detail and context than just names and dates. She knows how to use and exploit the structural powers of privilege that she's been able to access throughout her education and career. She redistributes the cultural memories, values, and identities that she cherishes. And even if we can't see this small collection at the Borthwick as a counter archive, Noni is bearing witness, and even one might say offering small acts of resistance against the more dominant Eurocentrism by centering her voice and culture. She wields, preserves, and mobilizes that voice through the dissemination of physical copies, while not relinquishing or diminishing the originals, a narrative of her own experience and identity that we're privileged to care for at the Borthwick. And I've just got the couple of references there to the archives at the Borthwick and a few citations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. It was incredibly rich and just so thought-provoking, and I know we'll pick up on those points. And thanks again to Kosi for giving us that really profound overview of Noni's life and her contributions. Now to move on to our discussant, Athambile, who will round things up, and then we'll go on to take some questions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming, and it's really exciting for us that we managed to pull this off again. So I'm going to tie some threads together, but also speak to some of what I find interesting as we continue having this conversation. And I think thanks to Charles also, I think you've introduced us to a new image, because the Makiwane family portrait wasn't in our previous presentation. So the archive is also a gift that keeps on giving. So I like to start with how I come to Noni Jabavu, because they're quite interesting intersections insofar as I grew up in East London, which is where Noni passes away. I in fact realized I used to walk past the Lynette Frail Care Centre on my way to Master Maths, which was like an after-school maths program. With absolutely no idea that there was this pioneer within walking distance while I was in high school. And then when I was in university, I used to write for the Daily Dispatch, which is the same newspaper that she wrote for in 1977. And I found a copy of the first book of hers that I read was The WRoCAH People, which I found in a library in a monastery just outside Grahamstown. Well, it's in Grahamstown. It was Grahamstown then, it's Makhanda now. Which is where she had spent some time. So I like the intersections, and I think since the previous panel that we had, when I saw the images of the Mount School, it felt very similar to the images of the girls' school that I went to in East London. So those kind of overlaps are always interesting for me as I keep doing this work. So as a way of kind of tying together what Charles and Kosi spoke about, I want to read the acknowledgements from the WRoCAH People and Drawn in Colour. The one in Drawn in Colour, which is the first book, is a bit long, but I'm going to read it anyway. She says, the following friends, not all of whom agree or identify themselves with everything I think or say, have solicitously cheered me at my work, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart. Mr. Robert Graves, who invited me to stay with him and his family in Maloka, thus giving me inestimable peace and quiet during the last arduous weeks of typing. The Baroness Ravensdale, for generosity, most imaginative, elegant, and kind. Mr. Norman Prouting, for giving me the freedom of his charming house in Chelsea when I grew weary of the furnished flat I had taken in Westminster to do my revisions of this book. And I can never give enough thanks for continual moral support during the whole time I worked in London to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Shilver, Mr. James Cameron, the Honourable Anthony Gregg, Mr. Charles Lewis, Mr. Philip Mason, or to the Countess of Clarendon for being the first to urge me years ago not to be content with merely reminiscing to her and other friends about my Bantu background, but to write it all down in a book so that other people might share it. And I can never thank my family in South Africa enough for the part they have played. I'm mostly deeply and affectionately grateful to Mrs. Orseth Leaston for her very great understanding, unfailing encouragement, as well as for the incomparable assistance she has given me throughout the writing of this book. And I thank Sir John Murray very warmly indeed for his interest and for his most helpful advice. I would also like to thank Mr. Cyrus Brooks for his immense sympathy and for showing his faith in my efforts over many months. Finally, I am indebted to Mr. Roland Brown for most kindly checking the manuscript and making valuable corrections on technicalities and facts. So that's Drawn in Colour, which was the book published in 1916. And in 1963, in The Ochre People, she writes, very short, half a page. Some writers are comparatively self-contained and can work without constant support from their friends. I must confess that I am not one of them, and I am immeasurably indebted to a number of people for crucial help given in individual and imaginative ways. My husband, Michael Cadbury Crossfield, Mr. Peregrine Worston, my kin in South Africa, Mrs. Z.K. Matthews and Mrs. Frank Lebentlele, who checked facts and references. Lady Montague Norman, her brother-in-law, Mr. R.C. Norman, Mr. James Cameron, Mr. Robert Graves, Baroness Ravensdale of Kiddleston, Mr. Bernard Webster, and Mr. Watson Taylor, Viscount Dunluce, and his parents, the Earl and Countess of Antrim. And as always, my publishers, Mrs. Osseth Leaston and Mr. John Gray Murray, to both of whom I am most deeply and affectionately grateful for unfailing encouragement, assistance, and understanding throughout the writing of this book. Now I read those because it's been an interesting contrast insofar as the 1982 publication, which was published in South Africa, where there's a preface kind of introducing herself to a South African audience, but no acknowledgements. And what I pick up from this, or I guess the story I'm telling myself about this, is the interest or the change in the various publics that she has from 1960, 1963, and 1982. And what we notice, of course, in the 1960 and 1963 are also very titled people and people whom she describes as her friends. So you get a sense of someone who's in the social milieu or a cultural milieu of people who are in upper class London and upper class England. And for her, perhaps it's almost something that she takes for granted, given her education and given whom she would have interacted with through those connections. But by the time we get to 1982, it seems to me perhaps that she doesn't have the same kind of public in the way that she did with her first two books. And part of that is because she's in Zimbabwe in 1982, and she's having all kinds of struggles. Some of her possessions are still in various, I think it was in England or in London at the time. And so there's also the sense of not being settled, even in Zimbabwe. And as Kosi showed, how she ends up leaving Zimbabwe, coming back to Zimbabwe, and then ending up in South Africa a little later. So I think those three texts, in a sense, tell us about the implications of the movements and what implication they have, not only for her writing career, but for the cultural and social capital, perhaps, that she holds throughout her life. And so we can see a pioneer within a social and cultural milieu just by looking at the texts themselves. And of course, there are other archives that, when we think of the letters and how she writes about her own social and cultural and political milieu, especially in the Daily Dispatch columns that Kosi mentioned. And of course, there are many reasons for these changes, but one of which is perhaps the changes in geography and the changes perhaps in class status, depending on which country that she's in. But what they show me is this idea of the story behind the book, which isn't so much the book history, but the story that often isn't told about the effect of having a social and cultural community of people and the implications they have for your own output and the implications that they have for your own growth. And so I've been wondering, is this particular to Noni Jabavu, or is it particular to perhaps other women who found themselves, people like Loretta Ngcobo, who would have been in London in the 1980s, people like Miriam Glady, who was traveling, but also in South Africa, when we think of the cultural and writerly output of South African women around the same time, is what are the implications of political movements on these communities, and what are the implications that they have for the kind of output that people are able to have. And even if we just look at the genres that Kosi mentioned, if we think of, there was music, there were the books, there was the editing, there were the columns and the op-eds. So you get a sense of someone who's incredibly prolific, incredibly talented, and we can speculate there could have been so much more. I mean, there was the biography of her father that she was working on. There were possibly other genres that she was working on that we don't know where they end up, or where they get lost, or where they get discarded. So when we see how she then inserts herself into the archive in the way that Charles has described, and that kind of agency, there's a sense of someone who understands not only the archive, but who understands the implications of just her own life and the kind of stops and starts, or the losses, by virtue of some of that movement, or by virtue of the political constraints placed on Black women writers in her time. And so we know that there are, as I said, works that have probably been lost, displaced, or thrown away because of this question of significance or importance, and those are other people's choices. So her ability to use her agency to deposit, whether it's the pictures, and I'd be interested in what's at Corey, maybe what at Rhodes University where she worked, and what they've done with that, because we also know that some archives don't get catalogued. So you go to a place and you say, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z, and if they haven't catalogued it, it's probably sitting in a box somewhere, or it's been taken by somebody else, which also happens. So perhaps just to end off, I want to talk about, I mean, I just found so striking this new image of the Makiwane family and how it disrupts the archive, which often leaves out, some of the challenges I've noticed is that the archive is pressured to kind of see people as individuals, and what those group pictures do, or those family portraits do, is to not only place her family or herself within a context, a longer lineage, but also a longer or broader community of people. And I'd be interested, Charles, I don't know if that image of the Makiwane family is dated, to find out when it was actually taken, because that will also tell us a bit more. We can make more speculations about who is in that image, because it's almost as if the Makiwane family lineage begins with the Reverend Elijah Makiwane without us knowing who his father was at certain instances. So these images are an invitation to think more about lists, to think more about the names that Noni Jabavu herself deposits, not only in the captions that Charles shared, but a lot more in the books themselves. She writes about being related to the Sakuba family. And yeah, final point is, even in thinking about the images of her being a schoolgirl in New York, I've come to think about this idea of the kind of the publicness or the public sphere in relation to Black girlhood. When we see that image of a young Noni Jabavu who was in London and York in the 1930s, I think about the women who were traveling to Scotland in the 19th century. Young women like Dause Soka, Letitia Ngeni, Martha Kwacha, who were Lovedale students who were traveling and living in London and Scotland, and the implications that that has for how we even read those images of her as a young girl at York. Maybe I should stop there.
Covered a huge amount of ground, and got us really thinking about so many different aspects of what her life and work means. And you know, there's so much to say, but I think that point, you know, one of the points around moving, you know, from the individual to the collective, and thinking about how one does make contributions and who one is indebted to, and how one's contributions emerge from a broader context. But I'm not going to say any more because we've only got 10 minutes and we need to open it up to the audience. So yes, we're just going to check the chat. Okay, would anyone like to make a comment or pose a question, either in writing or by unmuting? Ah, yes, please do, Kosi.
As we wait for the audience, Athambile asked the question, I'd be curious to know what's at Corey Library at at the University of Makhanda. I went there and I found a very interesting archive of a lot of information on Alexandra Kerr. So I'm busy challenging the archivist and saying, but if there's Alexandra Kerr's papers here, there should be DDT Jabavu's papers. They started at Fort Hare together at the same time. Why don't we have them? And the archivist just said, I don't know. Of course, because you didn't know. So what was interesting for me about that is exactly the point that Athambile is making, because then I needed to find out if there were any papers by her or any information on her for when she was there in 1977. And there was none. And I found a scholar who had been there when she was visiting. And the scholar, whose name I will not say, said to me, oh, she was here for just a few months. We didn't have to keep anything on her. Yes, I wasn't going to say that. But that's an interesting thing, because he's a scholar who at that time would have been the host because he was part of the university. And this is what he says about a visiting writer. So some of DDT Jabavu papers are found at UNISA in Pretoria here in South Africa. And just by looking at them, it was clear to me that there wasn't everything. But what was also interesting is that the photograph that Charles shared is also at those UNISA archives, because that was the first time I saw a photograph of Noni at that age. And I thought, wow, okay, this is what he looked like as a teenager. So yeah, I mean, I can only agree with both Athambile and Charles about the nature of the archive and the subjectivity and the politically driven subjectivity of who decides what ends up in the archive. To have been at WRoCAH, the university currently known as Rhodes, as a visiting writer, and your hosts say, oh no, we didn't keep anything because you went here for long enough, for me is like, wow, what does that mean? Because this wasn't just an ordinary writer. She had actually written books that were known worldwide and translated. To be taken by two publishers is a big thing. You know, one publisher in another country and another one across the seas, that's big on its own. And so when Athambile speaks about your public profile and how you're regarded and seen, clearly by the time she was in South Africa in 77, we're not even talking about the Zimbabwe leg of her life. She wasn't seen, she wasn't recognized, she wasn't known. Instead, she was just, you know, like dismissed in that way.
Thank you very much, Kosi. Yes, please do feel free to pose any questions. Perhaps I could just, there, yes. Thank you, Margaret. Yes, would you like to speak, or would you like us to read out your text? Yes, so I'll just, okay, yes, so Margaret, we're very honored to have Margaret Busby with us, of course, who is very much a pioneer in her own right, and who's really changed the face of publishing in the UK and around the world. And she's recently been honored and recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the London International Book Fair. And yes, and she's sharing with us that she first heard of Noni Jabavu in 1961 when she was at school in England and saw on the cover of the journal John O'London's. And we'd like to follow up, I'm sure, about that. And Margaret says she always credits her as an inspiration for her future career as an African woman claiming a space in the British literary world. So that's a wonderful connection to make. Oh, and Margaret's saying that she Noni Jabavu wrote to her in 1981. So, and our archive is expanding, and we're making more connections as we go through this conversation together. So thank you so much for sharing that, Margaret.
Can I say something?
Go for it.
So it's so lovely to have you on this forum, Margaret, because I remember jumping and not knowing what to do with myself when I held the first Daughters of Africa, because not only was Noni's writing in that book, but you also published her mother's writing in that book. To this day, it's the only writing I've been able to lay my eyes on by Noni's mother, Thandiso Makiwan. So I am eternally grateful for your choices, Margaret, both for the first book and the new Daughters of Africa. Your work, your contribution is, I don't even have words for it. Thank you.
Can I jump in? Because I'm also a huge fan. Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal to even hear those connections of one pioneer to another pioneer, and to see that, I mean, there's another kind of public happening, that the two of you recognized each other and what you were trying to do for yourselves. And also, I mean, Daughters of Africa, game changer for me. I still remember holding it for the first time when I was in high school in the public library in East London, and the new Daughters of Africa. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Wonderful. And that really brings us back to some of the questions about how we approach and commemorate Noni Jabavu, both as a Black British writer and broadcaster, and those publics, and also within South Africa, very much as a pioneering African woman. Yes, there's just so much more to explore and so much more to unearth, really. Yes. Athambile or Kosi, do you want to pick up on some of the other points in the chat?
In December 72, Noni Jabavu was already living in Nairobi and married to a younger Kenyan policeman, a quiet man, and remember him. Wow, thank you very much for that information. I remember reading about that in an archive at UCT. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, I'd love to connect with you, Linda, further about details, because in that archive at UCT, it was more like a passing mention, a letter from one person to the other. And the scholar whose papers it was had actually communicated with Noni, and she was saying, oh, I'm now married to so-and-so. And they were talking about something else, but she did mention that in passing. So I'm quite curious about any details you'd be willing to share.
And thank you so much for joining our call today, Linda.
Yes.
Great. I think we've got 3 more minutes for any last thoughts or closing comments. Athambile, Kosi, Charles.
Maybe I'll take a step just to say thank you so much for this kind of recognition, because it's impossible to talk about Noni Jabavu without kind of bringing in a British audience and a British public, and that for me makes it so fascinating, is that there's always another layer to her story. And I think it would be great one day to find if there's a Jamaican researcher who could tell us more about the publics that she was involved with in Jamaica, in Italy. And so I think every time we have these events, it's an invitation to kind of really see how transnational, Black internationalism or transnational that she was. And so it's not so much the pioneering, definitely the pioneering of her writing, but also the way in which she traversed the world for me is still another layer that I think I really want to get into.
Indeed, because when you get into a space, sometimes you don't find the right people. When I was in Jamaica and I went to the University of West Indies and I read their archives about the writing, and I couldn't find Noni anywhere. So I clearly had the wrong connections. Maybe I was too enthusiastic. I just needed to go and I was hoping to find her in the archive and she wasn't there. When I was in Nairobi at the university, I ended up with a lot of scholars who teach African literature and they hadn't heard about her. So there would be somebody who would have heard about her in Nairobi. I just haven't reached her. Athambile hasn't reached her. And we keep hoping that we will get to them. When I was in Uganda, somebody said to me, who was one of my contacts, said to me, oh, you know what happened in Uganda? Our literature and who was the president? Yeah. Idi Amin just made sure that everything is put to fire. And so we don't have any records. And I thought, that's very interesting, because when I was in Uganda, I was looking to track her movements and at least what she wrote, the newspapers that she wrote for. And this is what this person said to me, oh no, you won't find anything, forget about it. So yeah, I think the question about, which we keep referring to, is finding the right people in any one space who might, even if they haven't seen the record, have their own experience in the same way that Margaret is sharing, have their own experience and recollections of who Noni was in their world in that time.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. A last word from you, perhaps, Charles, and then we'll close off.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting, the fragility of the archive as well, and where that appears. And I think that was something that Noni was very well aware of with the Makawani family group photo. Unfortunately, it isn't dated, although she explains that she acquired the copy in 1951 from her cousin. But in her book, her second memoir, she describes a bit more about the photograph and the fact that the family had lost the negative. And so actually it came from a family's desire to get copies made. And she tells the story of how they did that through the famous photographer Rhodes Tremere. And so you've actually, again, got this sort of tradition of realizing the value of, and them realizing the value of either material or their achievements and identity as a group, and preserving that through acts of sort of duplication. And then she continues that by, getting another copy made and depositing that in York. And as Cozy said, some of those copies as well, or the originals perhaps, are out there as well in UCT sort of archives. And so yeah, that awareness, passing on that story, and taking steps to protect both against the sort of the political and fragile nature of the archive, but even with that, still the difficulties of that and the importance of that kind of recorded history, and vulnerable to sort of things that are happening later in states and other people, or even, dare I say it, archivists cataloguing priorities. All of these things are still acting on, how visible or accessible material is, and that shape our understanding or fill those gaps. So lots of heartening news, as you say, in terms of sourcing people's recollections and links, and how even small personal archives can be as important as the big sort of corporate archive, or a big corpus of material in one library. So lots of interesting things to think about there.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you to all the our audience members who are posting messages in the chat, and also for your questions. I wonder if we could just end off with the final slide, Charles, which speaks to one of the questions around publications on Jabavu. So we have at least 2 forthcoming books and other kinds of publications forthcoming. And are you able? Yes, there we go. Thanks, Charles. And so both Athambile and Kosi are integral to these 2 books. So you're the best people to speak to these titles.
Which one do you want to do?
Speak on the first one.
Okay. So the Noni Jabavu, A Stranger at Home, is the collection of her Daily Dispatch articles, and Kosi and I have essays sandwiching and kind of situating the columns, and we're hoping that it will be out in 2022, and we've made quite a lot of progress with the family and finding hopefully finding the right person who can help us get that going. So that's been a long project. Just kind of waiting and waiting for the right time and the right people to kind of get us going on that. And that's an image that's available in the Amazwi archive, yeah? Which is, the Amazwi archive is what used to be the National English Literary Museum, which is in Makhanda, where, well, used to be Grahamstown, where Noni Jabavu spent some time. So there's another interesting archive in relation to the Corey Library down the road, saying they don't have anything, but up the road, they've got some pictures. So I'll pause there for now. Okay.
So the Foundational African Writers anthology is on Peter Abraham's, Noni Jabavu, Sibusiso Nyembezi, and Ezekiel Mpashela, who are South Africans all born in 1919. What an interesting coincidence. So the book is will be published by the Wits University Press. The release date for now is April. And I was invited to co-edit the book because initially the African Lit at Wits was thinking about initially the 2 scholars, Peter Abrahams and Ezekiel Mpashela. And as they were doing their research, they heard about Noni Jabavu and the fact that I was doing this work. And once I joined them, we heard that Sibusiso Nyembezi was also born in 1919. And so we then put this book together, which now has 18 contributions, and Athambile is one of them. And I also have a chapter there. And I decided for this book to write about her time at the New Strand magazine, because not only was it short and therefore not publicly known about, but also for me, it was just such an important time in her life and the kinds of contributions she was making in the world. But most importantly, in the chapter, I talk about how she writes about her role as an editor, which is also very interesting for me because it brings that kind of self-reflexivity that we often talk about. And what kind of positionality do you have to be occupying to be able to do that? And how do you do that? So we're very excited that this book is coming out. And yeah, it speaks to Black South Africans and their contribution as a collective, and what brings them together here is something they would never have thought would be the thing, because it's coincidental that they were all born in 1919.
Thank you so much. To end, and I would just want to thank our wonderful speakers and also the audience, WRoCAH and JIAS. Handing back to you, Jo.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panel today. That was a really fascinating talk, and I found it illuminating on many levels. Learning how somebody's life can illuminate so much more about the epochs that she lived through, what it teaches you about the archive, but also the thing that I was really touched by and really noticed was the affection that you talk about her with. it makes me want to learn an awful lot more about her, and I know I will be going and finding some of these writings that you've been talking about and looking for these books that are coming out. So thank you so much for that. It was inspiring and informative, and had a wonderful warmth. So I really appreciate that. So I would like to thank you for your time today. It's a wonderful opportunity for us at WRoCAH to be able to host this talk. The WRoCAH is based at the universities of York, Leeds and Sheffield. So to have something that links to a place where we are is really lovely. And as you say, connects us to the story in a way as well, which brings an extra resonance, I think. So yes, thank you so much for staying. And I'm glad that we were able to do something to amplify the story and to hopefully help you find the next connections that lead on from there. So I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as we did. And I'd like to just say that we will be hopefully putting the recording of this up online to share with people. So if you want to come back and dip into this talk again later, you will be able to do so. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much and goodbye.